Hello, my name is John Mitchell. I preach at the Calhoun Church of Christ in Calhoun, Georgia. Please visit us at our website at calhounchurchofchrist.com. If you would like to have an online Bible study with me or sign up for an online correspondence course, or if you have follow-up questions for this study or any other of the videos that I put out, then you can email me, John Mitchell, at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com. This is the second study in a series that we are doing on rightly dividing the Bible, the differences between the Old and the New Testaments, and how to understand them and apply them to our obedience to God as Christians. In our first study, we looked at the time of the patriarchs, the age of the patriarchs in which Adam lived, Noah lived, Abraham lived, Isaac and Jacob, and Job and Joseph lived. And we saw that you can read about the age of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, the book of Job, and also the first 19 chapters of the book of Exodus. That would be the period in which the children of Israel were delivered from Egyptian bondage through the leadership of Moses, and Moses led them to Mount Sinai. To give you just a brief summation of everything that we looked at from the patriarchal age, you'll see that it started at the very beginning of time with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and went all the way to Moses when Moses delivered the Ten Commandments to Israel at Mount Sinai. So Bible characters that you read about, such as Cain, Seth, Enoch, Noah, Job, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all of them lived in the age of the patriarchs. Moses lived in it all the way up until the Exodus. We saw in our last session that after they crossed the Red Sea, God began to began to hint to them of a new time that was coming, the age of the law of Moses, the Mosaic age, the Mosaic law. In Exodus chapter 16, we see this hint when he tells them to not collect any manna on the seventh day, something that they were not used to doing, not working on the seventh day. And then when they got to Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 20, he established that law of Moses with them at Sinai in Exodus chapter 20. And so that brings us to the age of the law of Moses. It began at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20. But one thing that still needs to be brought out in our study of the patriarchal age before we move on to the Mosaic age is that the law of Moses did apply solely to one nation, and that would be the nation of Israel. We see this right at the very beginning when it was first delivered to Israel. If you go to Exodus chapter 20 in your Bibles and you look at verses 1 and 2, when God begins to give to them the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law of Moses at Sinai, the very first thing that God said, Exodus 20 verse 1, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now who is he talking to? Who did he bring out of Egyptian slavery? It was not any other nation, any other culture, any other society or group of people except the Israelite nation. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, let's read verses 44 and 45. That's Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 44 and 45. It says, This is the law that Moses set before the people of Israel. These are the testimonies, the statutes, and the rules which Moses spoke to the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Notice, Moses spoke these laws and statutes and rules to the people of Israel, not to any other nation. Go to chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. Let's read the first 3 verses. Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 3. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. So you'll see that Moses tells Israel, God made this covenant with us. The law of Moses, the statutes and the rules that I'm speaking to you, he made that with Israel. Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today. He did not make this covenant. He did not give these laws to our fathers. He gave them to us who are here today. And so that tells us that Israel's ancestors who lived during the time of the patriarchs that we read about in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then going back even further, Noah and Adam, they did not, the Ten Commandments did not apply to them. The law of Moses was not given to them. Nehemiah brings this out as well. Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 1. He says, and all the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded who? He says that the Lord had commanded Israel. The law of Moses applied solely to the Israelite nation. But you see, that brings out a good question, though. If the law of Moses applied only to the nation of Israel, then what about everyone else in the world? What laws of God were the non-Israelites, the Gentiles, obligated to obey if they were not obligated to obey the law of Moses? Because the law of Moses was given to Israel. Now, there are several biblical points to bring up that are relevant to answering this question. Let's go over to Romans chapter 3. Look at verse 23. Romans chapter 3, verse 23, where Paul says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned. And we saw in our last session that sin, by definition, 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, sin is lawlessness. Sin is breaking the laws of God. Now, Paul says, all have sinned. That would mean that not only did Israel sin under the law of Moses, but the Gentiles also sinned during the Mosaic age. We get another hint of this. Go to Romans chapter 1 and look at verse 18. Romans 1 verse 18, where it says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. The wrath of God is revealed against who? Against all ungodliness. Not just Israel's ungodliness, not just their sin that they made by violating the law of Moses, but also the ungodliness of the Gentiles. So the Gentiles did sin during the Mosaic age. So we get other hints in the Bible that this is so. Look at Galatians chapter 2, verse 15, where Paul is talking to Christians of Jewish nationality, and he says, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Now, notice what he calls the Gentiles. He calls them sinners. Well, they would not be sinners if they did not have a law from God that they broke. They definitely sinned during the time of Moses. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 2. We get another example of this. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 2. Israel was told to destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. Now these nations that Israel would dispossess from the land of Canaan, those are Gentile nations. And God told them to destroy them. God told them to destroy all the places where those nations served their gods. You see, the Gentiles practiced idolatry, and God considered that sinful. But the only way that it could have been sinful if God had told the Gentiles that it was wrong for them to practice idolatry. I'll give you another example. Book of Jonah. Jonah was told to preach not to Israelites. He was told to go to a foreign country, a country of Gentiles, and preach to them. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up against me. Now notice what God is saying to Jonah here. He tells Jonah that Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrian Empire, an empire of Gentiles, not Israelites, that Nineveh, their evil has come up before me. Well, how could the Ninevites perform evil in the sight of the Lord. How could they sin? Must have been because God had given them laws in some way, somehow, and they had chosen to violate them. So we do see that the Gentiles did sin during the time when God had given the law of Moses to the nation of Israel. One thing that we need to remember about sin is that sin cannot exist without a law of God first being established. Again, Romans chapter 5, verse 13, it says in the last part of that verse, sin is not counted where there is no law. Again, 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, sin is lawlessness. Sin cannot exist unless a law of God first existed and the person who sinned violated that law. So, the Gentiles, they did sin, but there's a flip side of that coin too, because we do read in the Bible that there were some Gentiles during the time when God gave the law of Moses to Israel, that there were some Gentiles that were considered to be devout. Cornelius comes to mind. If you go to Acts chapter 10, now Cornelius was a Gentile. He was not an Israelite. The law of Christ, the gospel, had not yet been given to Gentiles. In fact, in Acts 10, we would see that Cornelius would be the first Gentile that the laws of Christianity was preached to. But even so, Cornelius had been living in the time, not only when the age of Christianity was first starting and the gospel was being preached to the Jews, but he was also alive before the age of Christianity. He was also alive during the closing days of the law of Moses, but he being a Gentile, the law of Moses did not apply to him. And yet, notice how he is described in Acts chapter 10, the first 4 verses. It says, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, notice, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now notice what is being said here about about Cornelius. He was considered to be devout. He feared God. He prayed to God. He gave alms generously to the people. Cornelius was someone who was obedient to the laws of God before he became a Christian, before he obeyed the gospel. So that raises the question, well, what laws of God was Cornelius and other devout Gentiles obeying, if not the law of Moses? Because Moses' law was not for the Gentiles. And Moses' law was not for the Gentiles, and yet some Gentiles, during the time when Moses' law was in effect for Israel, some Gentiles obeyed God's laws and other Gentiles disobeyed God's laws. Then there's only one conclusion that we can come to, and that is that the time of the patriarchs, the way that God gave laws to the patriarchs that we read about in Genesis, that still must have applied to the Gentiles even while the law of Moses was in effect from Sinai, and that would have continued all the way up until Acts chapter 10, when Cornelius was the first Gentile to whom the gospel of Christ in the Christian age was preached. And so that's all we have to say about the time of the patriarchs, the patriarchal age. And that leads us to the next age that the Bible speaks of, and that is the Mosaic age. And this would be the time in which the law of Moses was the covenant between God and one nation, the nation of Israel. Now, from a historical perspective, this took place from the year 1500 BC. That would be when Moses delivered the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law of Moses to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, and it would have gone all the way to the year 30 AD. That would be around 1500 years, and that would be when Jesus died on the cross. Now, when you read your Bibles, you can read about the time of the Mosaic age from Exodus chapter 20. Again, that's when Moses delivered the law of Moses to Israel at Mount Sinai, and then the law of Moses is in effect all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, with the exception of the book of Job. And then in the New Testament, when you are reading the gospel accounts, the gospel biographies of the life of Jesus, the time of Jesus' life before he died on the cross in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that also the law of Moses was in effect. And the reason I say that is because Jesus and the apostles, they were of Jewish nationality. They were living during the Mosaic age. They were, Paul said in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, that Jesus was born under the law, talking about the law of Moses. And the law of Moses was in effect all the way up until his death on the cross. Now, again, it must be stressed that when we talk about the Mosaic age, this was the age in which the law of Moses was given, again, only to one nation, the nation of Israel. We saw that a few minutes ago when we read Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and following. But let's go over and see another example of this. Go to the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, chapter 4, and look at verse 4. That's Malachi chapter 4, verse 4, where Malachi says, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb," again, or Sinai, for who? For all Israel. The law of Moses was given only to Israel, and that would include the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were a part of that law. Go over to Exodus chapter 34 and look at verses 27 and 28. That's Exodus 34, verses 27 and 28. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. So that this covenant that God made, the law of Moses, between God and Israel, that included the Ten Commandments. Moses said the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting with verse 12. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 12, it says, "Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the Ten Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me, Moses, at that time to teach you statutes and rules, that you may do them in the land that you are going over to possess." So we see it stressed again and again that the Ten Commandments were part of the law of Moses, and the law of Moses was given only to one nation, the nation of Israel, which means that Christians, we, believe it or not, and this might be something that many people find shocking, but we are not obligated to obey the Ten Commandments today, because they were given not to us. They were given to the law to Israel as part of the law of Moses. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But as we move on in our study of the Mosaic age, one thing that the Bible brings out about the law of Moses is that it was never intended to be permanent. It was never intended to last until the end of time. The law of Moses itself says this. Go to Jeremiah chapter 31, and let's read verses 31 and 32. That's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 and 32. Jeremiah was a prophet who lived during the time of the law of Moses. He was under the law of Moses. And notice what he says to Israel. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that I broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord." Now notice what he is saying. He's talking to Israelites who were currently living under the law, and he is telling them that days will be coming when God will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and it will be a different covenant that is not like the covenant that God made with their ancestors when he brought them out of the land of Egypt and brought them to Mount Sinai. Now, if you read Jeremiah 31, what we just read, verses 31 and 32, and then you go to the New Testament in book of Hebrews, chapter 8, one of the things that the book of Hebrews does is it shows that God did take the law of Moses out of the way, and he replaced it with Christ's covenant, a new covenant. And in talking about that, the writer of Hebrews brings out in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 and 9, talking about that first covenant, the law of Moses, he says, "For he finds fault with them when he says," and tell me if this sounds familiar, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord." Where was it that you just read that? You read it in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 and 32. You see, the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament is quoting that passage from Jeremiah to show that the law of Moses was never intended to be permanent. In fact, go to verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 8. After quoting Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, the Hebrew writer then says, Hebrews 8, verse 13, "In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." So again, the Bible clearly teaches that the law of Moses was never intended to be permanent. One thing that the New Testament brings out was that the law of Moses ceased when Jesus died on the cross. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2 and look at verses 14 and 15. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Paul says, "For he himself," talking about Jesus, "for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one," Jew and Gentile contextually. "He has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility." What was that dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile back in the first century church? Look at verse 15. "By abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace." What did Christ do? He abolished the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. That's talking about the law of Moses. Let's go to what Paul wrote to Colossians. Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. Well, let's read verses 13 and 14 of Colossians chapter 2. Talking to Gentile Christians, Paul says, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses," verse 14, notice, "by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." Again, when he says canceled the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, he is talking about the law of Moses. And notice what he says then in verse 14, "This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." When did the law of Moses cease? It was at the cross. It was when Jesus died. Paul says something similar. In Galatians chapter 3, let's read verses 19 through 25. Galatians chapter 3, verses 19 through 25. "Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. Is the law contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law." He's talking about the law of Moses there. "But the Scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Now before faith came, we, that would be Paul and his fellow Jews, we were held captive under the law of Moses, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then, the law, again, the law of Moses, was our guardian until when? Until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So what is he saying? He is telling us that the law of Moses was in effect. It was given to Israel until Christ came. And the reason it was given, look again at verse 24. The reason it was given was to prepare Israel for the coming of the Messiah, to prepare Israel for Christ. So that is something that, when it comes to rightly dividing the Bible, that is something that we definitely need to remember. We definitely need to keep it in mind. Now let's continue our study of the Mosaic Age. We will see when we study the New Testament that Christ ended the law of Moses, and by doing that he ended the Mosaic Age, and that would include the Ten Commandments as well. Again, let's go back to the book of Romans. Let's go to start out with Romans chapter 10 and look at verse 4. It says, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Notice what he says. Christ is the end of the law, talking about the law of Moses. Christ ended the law of Moses. Go to chapter 7 of Romans, where Paul goes into this in greater detail. Let's read the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. "Or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law," talking about the law of Moses, "that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law," talking about the law of Moses, "through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now that we are, noticed, released from the law of Moses, having died to that which held us captive, so that we might serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code." Now notice verse 7. He says, "What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law," again talking about the law of Moses, "I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.'" Now, notice that, as you can see on your screens, that it says that Christ ended the law of Moses, and that would include the Ten Commandments. The reason why we know it included the Ten Commandments is because in chapter 7 here, he is talking about how the law of Moses ended. He's talking to Jewish Christians. He's trying to convince them that they don't need to look to the law of Moses in order to be saved. He is basically comparing their relationship with the law of Moses to a marriage, basically. One of the things he's bringing out in verses 2 and 3, that if you're in a marriage and you are bound by law to your spouse while the spouse lives, and yet if your spouse dies, you're no longer married to that spouse. You're released. And so then if you get together with someone else and you marry someone else, you're not committing adultery, not if your spouse has died, because you are released then from the marriage bond. And in the same way, verse 4, he tells Israelite Christians that they had died to the law of Moses through the body of Christ. So that's the point that he's making, that the law of Moses is not applicable to them. But that law of Moses does include the Ten Commandments, because in verse 7, while he's talking about contextually how they had been released from the law of Moses, he brings out that the law of Moses says, you shall not covet. You shall not covet is the 10th of the 10 commandments. And so when we say that Christ ended the law of Moses, that would include the 10 commandments. And that is why it is impossible for a Christian today to keep or to break the 10 commandments, because we are not under the 10 commandments. We never were under the 10 commandments. Now, that raises a question. Well, are you saying that it's okay to take God's name in vain then, John? Are you saying that's okay to murder or to commit adultery or to bear false witness or to covet or to steal? Because the 10 Commandments condemned all of that. One thing we need to remember is that the 10 Commandments were replaced with a new covenant, a new law, and that happened when Christ died. Let's go over to Hebrews chapter 9 and look at verses 15 through 17. That's Hebrews 9, verses 15 through 17. The writer says, therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. So what the writer of Hebrews is bringing out is that the law of Moses, and that would include the 10 Commandments, was replaced by a new covenant, Christ's covenant, when Christ died on the cross. Now, we are under that new covenant, the New Testament. And when you read the New Testament, the New Covenant, you will see that all of the 10 Commandments are given as law to Christians. And I say that, and I also say all the 10 Commandments with the exception of one, and that would be the Sabbath commandment. The Sabbath commandment, you can read about that as part of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. In the New Testament, you do not read of Christians ever being told to observe the Sabbath commandment. And the reason for that is found when you look at Hebrews chapter 4. So let's go to Hebrews 4, and let's read the first 11 verses. That's Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. It says, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest, and by the way, that word rest, that's the same word in the Hebrew and Greek for Sabbath. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest, or Sabbath, still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us, talking about Christians, just as it came to them, talking about Old Testament Israel. But the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listen. For we who have believed enter that rest. Again, the Greek word, the Hebrew word there is Sabbath. As he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day. That day is today, notice, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. Notice verse 9. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. One of the really cool things about the Bible is that the Old Testament, in many, many ways, foreshadows spiritual truths, spiritual realities in the New Testament. You take the Sabbath day, for example. The Israelites were commanded to work the first 6 days of the week, Sunday through Friday, but they were to rest on the seventh day. That seventh day was called a Sabbath, Sabbath meaning rest, just as God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. Now, that was something that happened physically in the Old Testament. They physically rested on a physical day, the seventh day of the week. They were commanded to. What the Hebrew writer is bringing out in Hebrews chapter 4 is that Christians need to be striving to enter the eternal rest that's waiting for us in heaven. So just as the seventh day of the week was Israel's physical day of rest, that foreshadows how spiritually Christians in this life work and strive to obey God in this life, and then if they obey the gospel and they remain faithful, then they also enter a Sabbath rest. But it's not a day of the week. It's talking about eternity in heaven. You see, the New Testament speaks of the Sabbath in that spiritual, eternal sense, not in the same way the Old Testament did. So under the New Covenant, all of the Ten Commandments, with the exception of the Sabbath day, were given as law. And so is it wrong for us to take God's name in vain? Yes, because the New Testament says that God's name is hallowed. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. Is it wrong to steal? Is it wrong to commit murder? Is it wrong to commit adultery or to bear false witness or to covet? Yes, because the New Testament condemns all of that as sin in various places all throughout the New Testament. But the reason we call that sin is not because they were part of the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament given to Israel. We do not appeal to the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, for salvation or as guidance for worship. In other words, we do not worship through animal sacrifices. We do not worship through a Levitical priesthood. We do not worship through the burning of incense as they did in the Old Testament, because we are under the New Testament, and God has given us a different way to worship, spiritual worship, worship in spirit and truth, that we read about in the New Testament today. So that leads us to one final question about the law of Moses and the Old Testament as a whole. And that question is, does this mean that the Old Testament has no value to the Christian today? Does this mean that if we're under the New Testament, that we don't need to read the Old Testament, that we don't need to study the Old Testament? And that is certainly not the case at all. Look at Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. Romans 15 and verse 4. It says, "For whatever was written in former days," talking about the Old Testament, "was written for our instruction," talking to Christians, written to instruct Christians, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures," and he's talking there about the Old Testament Scriptures, "we might have hope." Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and look at verse 11. Now, in the first 10 verses of 1 Corinthians 10, he is reminding his readers about everything that Israel did that was wrong when they were wandering through the wilderness with Moses, as recorded in the Old Testament. But notice what he says in verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10. He says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Again, the Bible speaks of different ages. We talked last time about the age of the patriarchs. In this lesson, we're talking about the age of the law of Moses. But the age of Christians, the age of Christianity, that is the end of the ages. He's talking to Christians here, and he's saying that what happened to Old Testament Israel happened as an example to us as Christians under the New Testament. It was written down where in the Old Testament, it was written down to admonish us. It was written down to instruct us. So we do need to read the Old Testament. We do need to study the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was written to teach us. It serves as an admonishing example to us. Now, we're not under the laws of the Old Testament. We're not under the worship practices of the Old Testament, but there is still much that the Old Testament can teach us. When we read the Old Testament, we can read much about the nature of God. For example, in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, it says that God does not change. When we read the Old Testament, we read of how God deals with his people. And again, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11 says that was written down as an example to us. So, to give you an example, in Leviticus chapter 10, when we read of two priests, Nadab and Abihu, and when we read that they offered God fire which he had not authorized, fire which he had not commanded them, when they offered that to him in their Old Testament worship, God was very angry. He did not consider that they were treating him as holy, and so he killed them. That's an example for us today that we must worship God the way he has told us to in the New Testament, by what he has authorized in the New Testament. Genesis chapter 18, when we look at Abraham, and God told Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, would you spare Sodom if you could find 50 people? Would you spare Sodom if you would find 40 or 30? Would you spare Sodom if you would find even 10? And God kept saying yes. He started out by saying, I'm going to destroy them. Then he said, no, well, okay, Abraham, I will spare them if I can find 50. I will spare them if I can find 40. I will spare them even if I can find only 10 righteous people among them. That teaches us about the nature of God. That teaches us about God's long-suffering, his patience, his willingness to go the extra mile in order to save us. And when we read the book of Job, and we read that God was proud of Job and bragged on Job to Satan, that Satan said, well, you know, the only reason Job is loyal to you is because you have made him wealthy. You've not allowed anything bad to happen to him or his family. If you would allow me to hurt him, then he would curse you to your face. And God decided to test Job. God gave Satan permission to destroy Job's family and to take away Job's wealth and to take away Job's health even. That tells us about the nature of God, that God tests us to see how loyal we really are. The Old Testament teaches us all about that. When we read of the people of the Old Testament, when we read of Daniel, Daniel teaches us how to be godly. When we read of Abraham and the faith of Abraham, that gives us an example of how to have a real strong faith. When we read of a man after God's own heart, David in the Old Testament, and yet we also read that David sinned. And when we read the Psalms of how he felt about his sin and his talk of why he sinned, that teaches us about how we can sin and why we would sin. When we read the Psalms in the Old Testament, it teaches us how to pray to God. It teaches us how to praise God. When we read the Proverbs of the Old Testament, it teaches us how to have much wisdom as we live this life here on earth. So yes, we must read and study the Old Testament. There is much value to the Christian from the Old Testament. It's just that in the Old Testament we read first of the time of the patriarchs, the age of the patriarchs, and then we read of the age of Moses, of the age of the law of Moses, the Mosaic age, and we see from the New Testament that all of that was taken out of the way, and now now there's only one more age left, the end of the ages, that is the Christian age in which we all are living, what the Bible calls the last days. In our next study on how to rightly divide the Bible, we will study the Christian age. I hope that this study has been beneficial to you. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, or if you would like to have an online Bible study or have an online correspondence course sent to you, then contact me, John Mitchell, at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com, and be sure to visit us on our website, calhounchurchofchrist.com, or on our YouTube channel, the Calhoun Church of Christ YouTube channel, for more content, more videos, more articles, and more lessons. Thank you very much for paying attention. May God keep you safe during these uncertain times that we live in. Thank you.